Hey guys, so we have already seen how we use properties in our React application. Now we'll try to explore the components API. Every time we see that React class extends some component API from the React library, what is that? What all it provides us? And we will see three of the key important methods out from your React library this time. And the first one is going to be the set state, where we have already used that, but we'll try to see it a little more in detail. The next we will see is the force update. I will also tell you what force update is, why it can be used, where it can be used, and when it should not be used. Similarly, we have a third one, which is React DOM find node, where you can actually find a particular element into your DOM structure and probably play with it using React. So we'll cover these three in this lecture. Now let's get started with a very quick example where we will implement the set state, and I have already cleared the whole console. So if you can see the start folder, again, let me show it to you. So if you can see the start folder, that's where you can start from. If not, you can just clear the files from your previous lecture and you can continue in the same lecture. But I will be having the final files in the end folder. Okay. Now that being said, I have the application, the header and the content class already created. So I will start writing my code and I will update the content class. Okay. So the first thing that we'll try to do is probably use a set state, which to use a set state, we need to make sure we have a constructor where we initialize the state. So the way we initialize the state is you can just write a constructor. You can call the super props this dot state, and in this dot states, let's say you have a data and this data is an array. So you can just determine how many times something happens and you can start updating the array with a new number. Okay. Now that's an array. Let me just add another variable called as count, just to see how many numbers we click on a button. So let me just create these two variables. Now that being said, let's just quickly add a button onto the screen. So the way we do that is, let me just change this p tag to a div, because you should not enclose anything in a p tag. And now let's add a button. So button. This is just an HTML button, so you don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is put an on click, and I will tell you what to do on click. Now in the button, you can just write a click here. Click me. And let's create an h4 tag where we will try to output the content. So h4, and here we will output this dot state dot data, and that's the array we created. Let's just add a label. So state data at this point is something like this, and when you click on the button, something should happen. Now here what we will do is we will try to pass in a function, and this function will ultimately update the state, because you cannot do a state update within the render function. So anywhere in React, you will not be able to do a state update in the render function. So just make sure when your components are rendering, you're not updating a state. Of course, React will also be giving you a validation error if you try to do that. So let's try to write a method. Let me say this dot update my state, and that's it. So when you call this update my state, it expects it to be a function. Now let's just define a update my state function. So it's very simple, straightforward. You just give the parenthesis and your function is ready. So that's how you define a simple function using the React components. Now in the components, what you can do is you can just say variable item is equals to click and something. And here what we can do is we can use the state, which is variable count is equals to this dot state dot count. So whatever is the current count, you just display the current count. Now let's do a count plus plus, which means it has been clicked one more time, and then you just add a count to it. Now that's your item. Now what you try to do is you get the current data and try to push in the new element. So let's say I have another array, which is variable my array, which is nothing but your data that you had. So you'll just do a this dot state dot data. So that gives you the current state data. Now what you can do is my array dot push, and that's how you push an element to an existing array. You push the item onto the array and save it. So now your data is saved. And once the page refreshes, you should start seeing the button onto the screen. So now that you see on the screen is the click me button and the state data. Now as per what we have done so far in the render method, we have a button, we have a state, and on click of this button, I call this function with a this dot function, and that's how you used to use everything within a component. However, when I click this button, nothing will happen. If you see, nothing will happen. The reason is after 0.14 of React, there has been changes, and due to ES6 implementation, what happens is when you try to use a function, you need to bind it to the particular class. And how do you do that? So whenever you have a constructor, the best way is whatever functions you're using in your code or your component, you just bind it in your constructor itself. So the way you do it is you do a this dot update my state is equals to this dot update my state, and then you do a bind dot bind and this. What you're trying to say is you need to bind this function to this class, and you can access the contents of this particular class inside that method. So that will also enable you to use the state. If you do not, and as you remember I already clicked it, you should see in the console it will say the state of null, cannot read the property state of null. What this means is when you click the update my state, it tried to access state from this keyword, and this keyword did not have any data or the state object because it was not bound to the class. So you bind it to the class in the constructor always, because we are using the ES6 version of it. Now that being said, let me save this, and I hope to refresh this and everything should be in place. And when I try to click this, nothing will happen. Well, the reason is I have not yet updated my state, and that's the last step in this process. So let's just go to update my state component or the function that we have and do this dot set state, and then of course this is a function which expects an array or a particular name and value pair. So you do a name value pair and then you close it. Now what we are going to update here is we are going to update the data. And what are we going to update it with? We are updating it with my array. So now when I save it and I go back to my application, it refreshes the page. And once it refreshes the page, I click it and the data should get updated. You see that? Click 1, 1, 1. And of course the count is not getting updated because we updated the count only out here, but we never did a set state for the count. So what is the next thing you need to do? You need to make sure that you update the count with the count variable. Now let's save it again and refresh it. So I click 1, click 2, click 3, click 4, click 5, click 6, and so on and so forth. So you saw 3 things out here. 1 is how to call a particular function from a button click in the render method. 2, how to bind your class constructors or the class parameters using the bind keyword in the constructor. And 3, how to set the state, which means you can set any number of states and it will get updated and it will get appended that you want to. So just in this scenario, we replaced the my array completely. In this scenario, we updated the count. Now, you can update the state only when your components are not rendering. So make sure that you abide by it, because if you try to make a state update out here, let's say for example, when you're rendering this dot set state, and let's say I'm just trying to set the count to 0. Save it and run it. Now when I run it, it will refresh the screen, and when I go and see in the console, it will continuously keep on popping an error saying maximum call stack exceeded because there was a warning. Set state cannot be updated during an existing state transition. So make sure that you're not updating any state during a state transition. Okay, let's save this, refresh it. So we have our first example and the set state done correctly. Now let's move on to the second one, which is the force update. So let's try to use the same setup that we already had for updating the state. But in this scenario, let's try to force update a particular component. And why will you need that? I'll shortly tell you that. So let's say I have another button. And let me call this as random number. And let's have another h4 tag. What this will do is this will just print out a random number. So random number is, and let's just do a math dot random. Let's just run it. Should update, and there would be a random number displayed. But what if I need to update this random number? Now the random number will not get updated by itself. There has to be some action or a component or a value that changes in the state that triggers it. Now how do we achieve that? If you want to update a component by itself, or probably without anything getting updated, but you want to do it based off your requirements. Now in that scenario, what we can do is we can tie a function to this random button number, and that will force update the component, which means this number. So let's try to do that. So just like we had an on click in the previous example, let's do an on click, and instead of this dot, let's do a random, actually let's say force update random number. I just want it to be very explanatory. And now that we have done that, let's copy this, and of course let's go to our constructor to bind it just the way we binded the update. So this dot this is equals to this dot force update random number, and then dot bind of this. So that's the second step done. Now it will not find the function and probably give you an error. So let's just define the function. Now save the file so the page refreshes at least. And now let's just code this function. And how do we code that function? It's very straightforward. As long as you have this variable that you binded with the current function, all you need to do is this dot force update, and that's it. Just a semicolon and save the file. So every time you click that random number, it will generate a new random number and update this component. Let's click that, click that, click that, you see. And the power of React is such that not the entire page gets refreshed, but only that particular component gets refreshed. So let's see, the random number is here, and if I click it, it gets updated. You see that? Very easy, right? And you can also force update any component that you wish to, but use it with very caution, because if you keep on updating force update in a loop, which means that component will continuously keep on updating, and if that continuous updation happens, it will deteriorate your performance. So make sure you use force update only when it is extremely needed. The next we are going to see is find DOM node, and this function or this method will help us find anything in our DOM and then use it, of course, like for example, style it, change its position, or probably hide it or show it, and that's what you can do using the DOM node. Now let's see how we can implement that. So just the way we had the same button, let's create another button, and of course some text. So rather than an h4, let's create a div. Let's give it an ID equals my div, so it's easier for us to get it. Now I have created my div and a button, and in the on click button I will just update this to find my DOM node. Simple, right? So let's call this as a function, and then let's say find my DOM node. So this is my new function, so the page should refresh. Oh, it still prints the random number because I haven't updated the text yet. This is my div. So you should start seeing this is my div below this function. Now how can you find it in the React tree? So the way you do it is you have already created the function. The next step is to bind that function. So let's just bind it. So this dot the function name, this dot the function name dot bind, and then to this keyword. So that binds the function, but don't save it yet because you will start getting exception. Now let's just write the function call here, and now you declared the function, you can save it and the page should refresh correctly. Now before even we get to finding the DOM node, the first thing we need to do is we need to import the React DOM. So just the way you imported React from React, now you need to import React DOM from the React DOM library. So with React DOM, you can use a function or a method that is there in the React DOM to find the node. So let's try to make it work. So you do a variable myDiv is equals to, which is very straightforward, document dot get element by ID and then pass the ID as myDiv. It's all lowercase. Okay. So this will give me the element in JavaScript. Now that I have found the div, all I have to do is in the React tree, I need to go ahead and make some changes to it so that I can play around with it. So React DOM dot find DOM node and then pass in the div that you had. Now that you got the div, you can just update its style. Let's say color is equals to red. Let's save it. Oh, okay. It should be find DOM node. Find DOM node. And not find my DOM node. Okay. So let's just save it and let's click it. And the color turns to red. Very easy, right? So this way you can find any of the DOM nodes and you can update or play with it just like you do it in plain JavaScript. So that's how you can use the React DOM, which is the virtual DOM, and update the contents that can be reflected onto the user screen. So we learned 3 things in this class: set state, force update, and find DOM node. These are very useful methods, and that's why there was a separate class dedicated to it. I hope you learned a lot, practice your sessions, and I'll see you in the next class.